The Bureau of Reduction occupied the seventh ring of the diadem spire, and it was, by the honest admission of everyone who worked there, the least glamorous office in the Ascendant Empire. Nobody sang about auditors. The war poets sang about the line marshals and their banner ships, about the burning of the Null Cluster and the kneeling of the 16 kings, about the diadem itself turning slowly above the homeworld like a crown that had decided to become a moon. Nobody had ever composed a stanza about a mid-grade HFY clerk sitting in a windowless cell with his 4 hands on 4 separate ledger slates, calculating how much of the Empire's strength was required to break a species that had not yet been broken. Second Auditor Rhess Vaunhal had made peace with this. He had made peace with it the way a river makes peace with a stone, which is to say he had gone around it patiently for 11 years and had eventually worn a channel through. The work was simple in principle and endless in practice. When the Empire found a new species, the Bureau assigned it a reduction coefficient, a single number describing what fraction of the Grand Fleet would be needed to bring that species to terms. The coefficient was the product of 11 subindices, each of which was the product of dozens of measurements, each of which was assembled from survey reports, intercepted broadcasts, trade manifests, orbital thermal maps, and when the Empire could get them, the corpses of ships. Get the number right, and a line marshal sailed out with exactly enough force to make resistance visibly pointless, which usually meant nobody died at all. Get the number wrong in one direction, and the Empire wasted hulls it needed elsewhere. Get it wrong in the other direction, and a line marshal died along with 40,000 crew, and the Bureau of Reduction got a new second auditor. Vaunhal had never gotten a number wrong. He was quietly, unspeakably proud of this, in the way that a man may be proud of a thing nobody else has ever noticed. The species on his slates that season was catalogued as 4471. Its members called themselves human. They occupied a single yellow star system and a scatter of thin colonies out along a filament of nearby suns, and by every measure the Bureau possessed, they were unremarkable. Their industrial output was middling. Their energy signature was middling. Their weapons, the Empire had recovered 3 human hulls from a border incident 20 years ago, were competent, unimaginative, and made of extremely ordinary materials. Their broadcasts were a chaos of argument. They had no unified state, no war cast, no orbital fortresses worth the name. Their military spending, as a fraction of what they produced, was among the lowest the Bureau had ever recorded for a species that had achieved starflight. Vaunhal ran the 11 subindices. He ran them a second time because he ran everything a second time. He wrote the number. Reduction coefficient, 0.09. 9% of the Grand Fleet. About 1,000 hulls, though the Bureau in its wisdom would send more, because the point of a reduction was to be so obviously overwhelming that nobody had to shoot. In practice, the Admiralty would trim it, because the Admiralty always trimmed it, because line marshals like to win with less and be sung about. He appended his standard note, coefficient assumes visible force is total force, confidence, high. He appended because he was Rhess Vaunhal, a second note smaller in the margin where nobody would read it. Species 4471 devotes an unusually large share of public expenditure to items the surveys cannot classify. Recommend classification. The margin note was ignored. The margin notes were always ignored. Vaunhal filed the schedule, closed his slates, and went home to his narrow apartment on the 90th tier and slept without dreaming. And 11 months later the Empire sent 340 warships to the human colony at Sable Verge, which was more than enough, and which was also the beginning of the end of the Ascendant Empire's 4,000-year certainty that it knew what it was looking at. 9 light years and 1 long silence away, in the cold outer dark where the sun was just the brightest of the stars, Nell Cade was welding a seam that nobody would ever see. She was 22 years old. She had been doing this since she was 18. The seam ran along the inner keel of hull 41,208, a Tarpon-class frigate that had been laid down before she was born, and it was the 400 and something th seam she had certified that year, and it would never carry a crew, and it would never fly, and everybody in Yard 19 knew it. The Kuiper yards were a strange place to spend your youth. Yard 19 was a spindle of pressurized tubes and open scaffolds 30 kilometers long, hanging in the black above a dirty ice moon nobody had bothered to name, tethered to a mast driver that flung refined hull played up from the surface in slow silver arcs. It was cold enough that the yard's inner corridors had a permanent frost bloom in the corners. It smelled of ozone and hot metal, and the particular sour-sweet reek of recycled air that has been recycled a great many times. And it was quiet. That was the thing outsiders never understood about the yards. Nobody shouted. There was no music. The suit radios carried only the flat murmur of the shift channel CADE 41208 keel run 7, confirm, and the endless soft click of certification stamps. Nell floated in the dark of the keel trench with her welder's mask down and her tether clipped to a ring, and she laid down her bead of molten alloy, and she watched it cool, and she ran the scanner over it, and the scanner said what it always said, which was pass, and then she took the little pneumatic punch from her belt and set it against the plate beside the seam and squeezed. Chunk. 4 characters, pressed a ½ millimeter into steel that had never seen a sun. NKD asterisk. Nobody would ever see it. That was the joke of the whole thing, the joke that got told in the mess hall 4 times a shift by people who had stopped finding it funny years ago. You spent your life putting your name on the inside of ships that were going straight into the cold rose, and the cold rose never came back out, and in 80 years somebody would cut hull 41,208 up for scrap, and the torch would go right through asterisk NKDE asterisk asterisk, and that would be that. She unclipped, kicked off the frame, and drifted down the trench toward the lock, her helmet lamp sweeping across 400 meters of ribs and stringers and pale bare metal. Every 20 meters, another little stamp winked back at her out of the dark, some hers, some belonging to people who had died before she was born. TOY, MVSQ DSUN, RIBRAHIMOV. The dead had welded here, too. That was the thing about the long provision. It had been going on so long that it had started eating its own workers. The long provision was 61 years old, which meant it was older than anyone Nell worked with except Foreman Adie's son, who was 93 and had the yard's serial number tattooed on the back of her hand, and refused to retire on the grounds that she had nowhere better to be. It had started with a drone. Not an invasion, not a war, nothing so satisfying. Just a survey drone the size of a bus, drifting in through the Uwad on a hyperbolic course, taking pictures. It had not been armed. It had not been hostile. It had not even been particularly interested. It had photographed the outer planets for 6 weeks, ignored every attempt at contact, and then it had accelerated out again on a vector toward a star humanity could see but not reach. And that was all. Nell had learned about it in school, the way every human child learned about it, in a 2-page section between the last of the resource wars and the first of the belt compacts. The drone had told humanity 3 things. It had told them they were not alone. It had told them that whoever was out there had not thought them worth speaking to. And it had told them. This was the part that had done it, the part that had gone into the species like a splinter and never come out. That whoever was out there had known exactly where to find them, and had come and gone whenever they liked, and there had been nothing anyone could do about it. There had been a great deal of shouting for about a decade. There had been 100 grand plans, most of which came to nothing. And then, slowly, the shouting had died down, and what was left behind when it drained away was not a grand plan at all. It was a budget line. The long provision was, in the end, a piece of accounting. Every human polity that wanted a seat at the compact table paid into it. The money went to yards, and the yards built hulls, and the hulls went into the cold rows and were mothballed, and every year the yards built more. The provision also paid for depots vast, boring, buried caches of food and water and reaction mass and spare couplings, scattered across 100 rocks nobody would ever visit. And it paid for the service, 60 days a year from age 18 for everyone doing something, anything, welding, filing, running damage control drills in a mock corridor that flooded with cold water, while an instructor yelled at you about hatch discipline. It was the most boring institution in human history. It was also, by a wide margin, the largest thing the species had ever done, and it had done it the way a coral reef is made, one small, dull, unremarkable increment at a time, by people who did not live to see the shape of it. Nobody was proud of it. That was what Nell could never get anyone to understand later. Nobody was proud. It was a chore. Politicians ran on cutting it and then quietly didn't because their grandmothers would have skinned them. Comedians made fun of it. Every generation had its movement to abolish it, and every generation the movement got exactly as far as the phrase "what if the drone comes back," and then stopped, embarrassed, and went home. So the yards kept building, and the cold rows kept growing, and nobody looked at them because there was nothing to look at. "You're doing that thing again," said Toma Oyalaran without opening his eyes. They were in the mess, second meal, the long window running down one wall showing nothing but stars and, at the very edge, the faint pale ladder of the rows. "What thing?" "The staring thing, you do it every shift now." He cracked one eye. "Nell, it's a warehouse. You are staring at a warehouse." "I'm not staring at anything." She was staring at the rows. They ran out from yard 19 in ranks, and the ranks ran out to the limit of sight, and past that limit they kept going. Mothballed hulls, tethered nose to tail, powered down to a whisper, coated in a white ablative wrap that made them look from a distance like the vertebrae of some enormous animal laid out in the dark. Frigates. Then further out the corvette rose tighter and denser. Then the long spine of the heavies, so far out that the running lights on their wrap were just a suggestion of a straight line where no straight line should be. Yard 19 was 1 yard. There were 14 in the Kuiper cluster. There were 41 in the belt. There were more at Jupiter and at Saturn and out at the Neptune trailing point. And she had heard, though nobody talked about it, there were rows out at the colonies too, in the Verge and the Reach and the thin filament worlds, tucked into the shadow of moons. She had done the arithmetic once, when she was 19 and angry. She had done it wrong. She'd been off by an order of magnitude in her estimate of the far rows, and when she'd asked Foreman Sun to check her work, Sun had looked at the number and looked at Nell and said, "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't count," Sun had said. "It's not a number that helps you, it's just a number that makes you strange." "I've been here 4 years," Nell said now to Toma, to the window, to nobody. "I have put my name on 1100 seams. Do you know what 1100 seams is?" "A lot of seams." "It's 4 years." She poked at her food. "It's 4 years of my life on the inside of ships that will never move." Toma sat up. He was 2 years older than her and had grown up on series, and had the belt habit of laughing at things that weren't funny. "They might move," he said. "They won't." "They might." "Toma, there has been one shooting incident in the whole history of our species meeting anybody else, and it was 20 years ago, and it was 3 ships, and it was over a mining claim, and both sides ran away." She jabbed her fork at the window. "That is 900 years of shipbuilding out there, for a species that has been in one fight." So what's it asterisk for?" Toma looked at her for a long moment. Then he shrugged, and said the thing that every human being said, eventually, when cornered by that question. The thing that had been said so many times that it had stopped being an argument and become a sort of shrug in the shape of a sentence. "What if the drone comes back?" he said. and Nell put her head down on the table, and Toma laughed, and the rows went on out into the dark, and neither of them looked at them. 3 weeks later, the news came in from Sable Verge. It came the way news came in the outer system, 11 hours late, compressed, stripped of nuance, a text crawl on the mess hall wall that people stopped and read and then read again. Contact at Sable Verge, NON human VSSELS in system, count estimated 340 plus, hostile. Somebody dropped a tray. Nell remembered that clearly afterward. Not shouting, not screaming, just the flat clatter of a tray hitting deck plate and the long, awful, indrawn silence of 200 people reading the same 4 lines. Then Foreman Adi's son, 93 years old, put down her cup. She did not look surprised. That was the part Nell never forgot. Every other face in that room had gone white and slack and young, even the old ones, especially the old ones, and Adi's son, who had been welding hulls in this yard for 70 years, simply put down her cup and looked at the crawl with an expression of enormous, weary, unsurprised patience. Like someone hearing a knock they had been expecting for a very long time. She stood up, her chair scraped, everybody looked at her. "Third shift," she said, "is not cancelled." Somebody made a noise, half laugh, half sob. "Third shift," son repeated, "is not cancelled. Nobody goes home, nobody calls anybody. The comm lag is 11 hours and there is nothing you can say that will get there before this is over." She put her hands flat on the table and pushed herself up slowly, joint by joint. "You will finish your seams, you will stamp your plates, you will log your hours, and then you will sleep and then you will come back and you will do it again." "Foreman," someone started. "I know what you're asking," son said. "The answer is not yet. The answer is that we do not know what this is, and until we know what this is, the most useful thing you can do for the species is lay another good weld asterisk." She looked around the mess hall and her eyes were dry and old and terrible. "That is what this yard is. That is what it has always been. You are not going to be heroes. You are going to be asterisk ready." She walked out. Nell sat there with the crawl reflecting off the window, off the stars, off the long pale ladder of the rows going out and out and out into the black, and for the first time in 4 years she looked at them and did not see a warehouse. She went back to the trench, she laid down her bead, she ran the scanner, it said pass. And she set the punch against the plate and squeezed and thought, for the first time in her life, with a strange cold feeling low in her stomach, like standing at the top of a stairwell in the dark. Somebody is going to read this. NKDA. Line Marshal Ascendant Empire took Sable Verge in 19 days, and the Diadem Court called it a victory, and Line Marshal Ascendant Empire, who was not a fool, went into his cabin afterward and sat in the dark for a long time. He had brought 340 ships. The Bureau's schedule had called for 1,000. The Admiralty had trimmed it to 500. Kale had trimmed it again to 340 because he was 41 years old and had never lost and wanted to be sung about. The colony had 11 million people, 4 orbital habitats, a single ring-shaped defense platform of no consequence, and a garrison force of 214 warships. 214. Kale had read that number in his approach briefing and had felt the specific, pleasant disappointment of a man who has come a very long way to open a door that is already unlocked. The garrison force was designated in its own transmissions, Task Group 4, 9th Reserve Flotilla **. Reserve, that word had meant nothing to him at the time. They came out to meet him past the third moon, and they did not run, and they did not posture, and they did not send a single word of challenge. And this last thing was the first thing that bothered him, because every species posturing before a battle sends something, a demand, a boast, a plea. The humans sent nothing at all. They simply arranged themselves in a shape Kale's tactical officers did not immediately recognize, and then they began with an almost secretarial calm to kill his ships. They fought like a machine that had been oiled every day for 60 years, by people who did not expect the machine to ever be used. That was the only way he could describe it afterward, and he never did find a better way. There was no flair. There was no genius. There was no single dazzling maneuver he could point to and say there, "That is where they beat me," because they did not beat him. He took the system. He broke their formation on the 9th day and pushed them off the habitats on the 12th, and by the 19th day the last of them had withdrawn through the outer jump line, in an order so perfect it looked rehearsed. It was rehearsed. He understood that later, too. They simply did every single thing correctly, every single time, for 19 days, and they never got tired, and they never got sloppy. And when a human ship was crippled, it did not surrender, and it did not immolate itself in some ecstatic suicide charge. It fell back into a repair screen, and 40 minutes later it came out again with the hole patched and the crew redistributed and its guns hot. Kale lost 91 warships taking Sable Verge. 91, against a species with a reduction coefficient of 0.09. He sat in the dark in his cabin, and he thought about the way the human ships had held their intervals, and the way their damage control had worked, and the way, on the 14th day, a human frigate with its entire bow sheared away had continued to fire its aft battery for 6 hours while its crew, in vacuum suits in the open, had welded a bulkhead across the wound. And Ossian Kale, who was going to be sung about, wrote a dispatch to the Diadem Court that said, "The system is taken. Resistance was of a quality I did not anticipate. I request that the Bureau of Reduction re-examine species 4471 with the greatest possible care before any further advance is authorized." The court read it. The court congratulated him on his victory. The court authorized a further advance. The salvage from Sable Verge came to Vaunhal's office 11 weeks later, in the form of 406 crates of scrap, and a manifest, and no help whatsoever. The Bureau's Salvage Division did not want it. Salvage Division wanted weapons, drives, and command systems, the things that could be reverse-engineered and turned into a citation. What Vaunhal had asked for, in a request so unusual that it had required 3 separate approvals, was everything else. Hull plate, fasteners, ration containers, deck matting, fire suppressant nozzles, toilet mechanisms, boots. "You want their boots," the salvage clerk had said flatly. "Yes." "Why?" Vaunhal had considered several answers and given the true one. "Because a species will lie about its warships," he said, "and it will never think to lie about its boots." He laid the crates out in an empty training hall on the 17th ring, because his office was too small, and he worked at night, because his days were full of other schedules, and he worked alone because nobody wanted to help. He began with the fasteners. There were, in 406 crates of debris from 31 distinct human warships of 4 different classes, precisely 19 kinds of bolt. Vaunhal sat back on his heels and looked at them for a long time. He had, in his 11 years at the Bureau, catalogued the wreckage of 80 species. A typical starfaring civilization used somewhere between 400 and 4,000 distinct fastener types across its fleet, because ships were built by different consortia, in different yards, in different decades to different standards, and nobody ever bothered to make them agree, because making them agree was tedious and thankless and saved nobody's life on any particular day. The Ascendant Empire, which had spent 4,000 years perfecting the art of conquest, used 2,140 distinct fastener types in its grand fleet. Vaunhal knew this because he had once, as a young clerk, been made to count them as a punishment. The humans used 19 bolts, and a coupling from a Corvette's coolant line fit. He checked it 4 times. He checked it with calipers. He checked it with a witness he dragged out of a bar at the 4th hour. Fit * exactly into the coolant line of a heavy cruiser built, according to its plate, 31 years earlier in a different yard. Interchangeable, everything. Every hose, every valve, every deck panel, every seal. A part pulled from a wreck of one class could be walked across a hangar and bolted into a ship of another class laid down a generation apart, and it would fit, and it would work. Vaunhal understood, kneeling on the floor of an empty training hall at the 4th hour of the morning, that he was not looking at an engineering choice. He was looking at an decision made by somebody a very long time ago, and then enforced dully, unglamorously, against certain resistance, through decades of committee meetings that must have been agonizing by generation after generation of people whose names would never be known. You did not standardize a fleet because you intended to fight one battle. You standardized a fleet because you intended to repair it forever, in the field under fire with parts scavenged from anything to hand, for as long as it took. It was the single most patient thing he had ever seen. He moved on to the ration containers, and that was where it started to get bad. Human field rations came in a pressed foil brick with a printed panel. The panel gave a date of packing, a date of expiry, and a depot code. Vaunhal collected 411 ration bricks from the wreckage of 31 ships, and he laid them out on the training hall floor in a grid, and he read the panels. Dates of packing spanned 26 years. He stared at that. 26 years. The bricks aboard a single human warship had been packed across 26 years, which meant the ship had been stocked from a reserve and the reserve had been so deep, and so old and so continuously replenished, that a crew going into battle was eating food that had been sealed before the crew was born, and nobody had thought this remarkable enough to mention. And the expiry dates. The expiry dates ran forward, not by a season, not by a year. The most recently packed brick in his grid carried an expiry date 31 years in the future *. Nobody stockpiles 31 years of food for a war they expect to fight next spring. You stockpile 31 years of food for a war you expect to fight at some point in the next 31 years, and you have no idea when, and you will not be there for it, and you pack the brick anyway. Then he read the depot codes. RD007, RD141, RD088, RD233, RD019, RD312. He sorted them. He counted the distinct codes among 411 bricks pulled from a single colonial garrison at the far edge of human space. 284 distinct depot codes. And the highest number he found, on a brick from the galley of a frigate called Hakon, was RD419. Vaunhal sat down on the floor of the training hall, in the middle of his grid, and he did not move for some time. 419 reserve depots, at minimum, and that was only the ones represented in the crates that had happened to survive, from the ships that had happened to be crippled at one colony on the outer edge in the first fight. He was an auditor. He knew what a sample was. He knew what it meant when the highest serial in a small random sample was 419. It meant the true number was higher. The hull plate was the last thing he examined, and it was the thing that broke him. He had left it for last because it was the least interesting, bare structural alloy, unremarkable, mass-produced. He had a section of a frigate's inner keel that had come away in one great curved piece, 4 meters long, and he had it laid across 2 trestles under the training hall's flat white lights, and he walked along it with a magnifier, looking for nothing in particular, and he found the stamps. They ran the length of the plate, 1 every 20 meters of seam, which on this fragment meant 1, and then another at the very edge. Little pneumatic punches, 4 characters each, pressed a ½ millimeter into the steel. *DSUN. TOYE. Vaunhal did not know what they were. He photographed them. He ran them against the Bureau's linguistic index, and the index came back with a probability estimate that these were abbreviated personal names in one of the human naming conventions. personal names, stamped on the asterisk inside of the hull, on the keel, on a surface that would be sealed behind decking within days of being welded and never seen again by any living creature for the entire operational life of the ship. He could not, at first, think of any reason for it. He thought a ritual. He thought a religious practice, a votive mark. He thought graffiti and dismissed it because it was too regular, exactly one per seam, and because the punch marks were made with a tool and somebody had asterisk issued that tool. And then he found the other marking, near the plate's cut edge, larger machine-stamped official. Hull 40 1207, tarpon, YD19 laid 39, CERT per seam. CERT per seam. Certified per seam. Every weld on this ship had been individually certified by a named human being who had put their own name on it, permanently, in a place where nobody would ever look, so that if that weld ever failed, if it failed in 50 years, in a battle nobody had yet imagined, killing people not yet born, somebody could cut open the hull and find out who had done it. That was accountability at a depth Vaunhal had never encountered in his life. That was a species that had decided, as a matter of dull administrative policy, that the person who laid the weld should carry the weld's name for the rest of time. But that was not what broke him. What broke him was the number. Hull 40 1207. He read it. He read it again. He went and found the manifest of the Sable Verge salvage, and he went through every hull number the Empire had recovered from every wreck of every class, and he wrote them out in a column, and then he sorted them, and then he sat in the empty training hall at the 6th hour of the morning with 4 hands flat on the table, and looked at what he had written. The hull numbers of the human warships destroyed at Sable Verge ranged from 8,116 to 44,902. They were not sequential, they were not clustered. They were scattered across the range like, he made himself say the word in his own head in the cold white light, like a asterisk sample asterisk. 214 ships had defended Sable Verge. 214 ships out of a numbering system that had been in continuous use for at least 60 years, and had reached at least 44,902. Vaunhal was an auditor. He had spent 11 years learning the one truth of his profession, the truth that the poets never sang and the line marshals never learned. You never see the whole of a thing. You see a piece, and the piece tells you the shape of what you cannot see, and if you are honest, the shape is almost always larger than you want it to be. He picked up his stylus. His hands were not steady. He noticed this with distant, clinical interest. He wrote Species 4471, Preliminary Revision of Reduction Coefficient. He wrote, the force engaged at Sable Verge was designated by its own transmissions as a reserve flotilla, Task Group 4. The Bureau has treated reserve as an honorific. The Bureau is wrong. The word is literal. He wrote and then he stopped and put the stylus down and picked it up again. Estimated total human warship inventory from hull serial sampling, not fewer than 40,000. Confidence, moderate, lower bound only. He looked at the sentence for a long time. Then he added one more line, in his small, precise 11-year hand. The Grand Fleet of the Ascendant Empire numbers 11,400 hulls. And he stamped the report and he sent it, and he went home, and for the first time in his adult life, Second Auditor Rhess Vaunhal was afraid. The report went up through 6 levels of the Bureau, and at each level a superior read it, and at each level the superior did the same 3 things. First, they checked whether Vaunhal was known to be unstable. He was not. He had 11 years of unblemished service and had never once been wrong. Second, they checked whether the report could be true. They did this not by examining the evidence, but by examining the conclusion and holding it up against everything they knew about the galaxy and the Empire and the natural order of things, and finding that it did not fit, and therefore that it could not be true. Third, they attempted gently to help him. "Rhess," said First Auditor Senequil Osh, who had brought him into the bureau and who genuinely liked him, "the hull numbers are not hull numbers. They are stamped on the hulls. They are asterisk stamped on the hulls asterisk. Yes, in a numbering system we do not understand." Osh spread all four hands in the gesture of patient reason. "Species do this. You know they do this. The Maravine number their ships by the birth year of the captain. The Thosic number theirs backward from an eschatological date. You have found a big number on a wreck, and you have decided the big number is a count. The distribution. The distribution is consistent with 100 systems, Rhess. It is consistent with year of laying plus yard code. It is consistent with pure vanity. Do you know what it is not consistent with?" Osh leaned forward. 40,000 warships. Because 40,000 warships would require an industrial base that our surveys would have seen. We have thermal maps of that system going back 60 years. We would see the asterisk heat asterisk, Rhess. You cannot build 40,000 warships in the dark. And that, Vaunhal would think later in the ruin, with the stars going out one by one on his repeater screen, that was the sentence. That was the exact sentence on which the Ascendant Empire, 4,000 years old, master of 900 species and 11,000 hulls, quietly hanged itself. You cannot build 40,000 warships in the dark. You could, of course. You could build them in the dark quite easily. You simply had to be willing to do it slowly, so slowly that the heat never spiked, so slowly that in any given year the industrial signature of the effort was indistinguishable from ordinary civilian traffic, so slowly that no survey drone passing through on a hyperbolic arc would ever see anything but a species going about its business. 600 hulls a year for 61 years, spread across 140 yards, was nothing. It was a rounding error in a solar economy. It was less, as a share of what they produced, than the empire spent on ceremonial architecture. It was only asterisk enormous if you added it up. And nobody, in 4,000 years, had ever needed to add anything up, because in 4,000 years nobody had ever been asterisk patient at the empire. They did not demote him. That would have been an insult, and Osh was fond of him. They did something worse and kinder. They reassigned him to the field. "Kale is advancing on the human home system," Osh said. "The court has authorized 6,000 hulls. 6,000 Rhess more than half the Grand Fleet, because the court is not a fool and Sable Verge was expensive." He said it gently, the way you present a gift. "You will go with him, as bureau observer. You will see the human home system with your own eyes, and you will count whatever you like. And when you find that there is no fleet of 40,000, you will come home and write it up, and we will never speak of this again. And in 5 years you will be first auditor and I will be dead, and everything will be as it should be." Vaunhal was quiet for a moment. "And if I find that there is," he said. Osh's carapace clicked, once, in something that was almost affection and almost pity. "Then you will have been right," he said, "and it will not matter in the slightest because we will already be there." At yard 19, the sirens did not go off. Nell had expected sirens. She had expected she did not know what she had expected. Speeches, flags. Someone in a uniform standing on a crate. Instead, what happened, 4 months after Sable Verge, was that a message went out on the shift channel at 400 on an ordinary Tuesday, in the same flat voice that read out the SEAM assignments, and it said, "General Provision Order 1. All service personnel report to muster. All service personnel report to muster. Bring nothing." And then it repeated, and then it stopped. Nell was in the trench when it came. She had her mask down and a bead half laid. She stopped. The molten alloy cooled and set, an ugly, unfinished lump, the first bad weld she had made in 3 years. Around her, up and down 400 meters of dark keel, one by one, the welding arcs went out. There was a long silence on the shift channel. And then somebody, she never found out who, said quietly on the open frequency, "Oh." Just that, just "oh." The sound of 61 years arriving. Muster was in Bay 6, which was the only space in the yard big enough to hold everyone, and everyone was 2,300 people, and they stood in the cold with their breath fogging and looked at Foreman Adie's son, standing on a maintenance stand with a slate in her hand and no expression at all. "Right," she said. The bay was so quiet Nell could hear the tick of the hull cooling. "You have all been told," son said, "since you were 18 years old that the service is 60 days a year of drills you will never use, in ships you will never fly, for a war that will never come." She looked up. "That was a lie. It was a kind lie, and I have told it to most of you personally, and I do not apologize for it. But it is over now, so listen." She held up the slate. "Every hull in the Cold Rose has a manifest. On that manifest is a crew. That crew was assigned the day the hull was laid down, and it has been revised every year of your life, and you have never seen it because there was no reason to frighten you with a piece of paper." Her voice did not rise. It never rose. "Your assignment is not random. The provision does not do random. If you certified a hull's frame, you are that hull's frame officer. If you ran her pumps in the drill tank, you are on her damage control team. If you spent 4 years filing her spare part inventory in an office on series, then you are her supply officer, and you will find that you already know where every single bolt aboard her is stowed, because you put it there." Somebody in the third rank made a small, cracked sound. "You will be afraid," son said. "You should be, but understand what has been done here and understand it now because you will not have time to understand it later." She swept the slate across the crowd. "You have not been wasting your lives. You have been becoming the crew asterisk, slowly, in the dark, without being told, for your whole adult lives." She lowered the slate. "Yard 19 holds 4,106 hulls," she said. "You will wake 3,000 of them in 9 days." And Nell Cade, 22 years old, standing in the cold in a welder's suit with a bad bead cooling behind her in the dark, felt the floor of the world drop away. Her assignment came up on her slate that night. KADE, NA Service No 41-722-06. Hull 41,208, Tarpon Class, Frame Officer **. Report Row 12, Rank 88, Berth 14. Note, you certified 419 seams aboard this vessel." She read it 11 times. 419 seams. She had never counted. Somebody had counted. Somebody, somewhere, in some office, in some building, had counted every seam she had ever laid and matched it against a hull and put her name on a manifest and never told her, and had gone home at the end of the day and eaten dinner and thought nothing of it, because it was Tuesday, and that was the job. Nell sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark and shook. Not with fear. She examined it and it was not fear, and it took her a long time to find the word. It was the feeling of being seen of discovering that the 419 small, cold, pointless hours of her life had been going somewhere the entire time, that there had been a shape to it, that on the far side of all that tedium there had been somebody, patiently, adding her up. She put her hand over her mouth and made no sound at all, and after a while she stopped shaking, and she got up, and she went to find Toma. He was already at the lock with his kit, and his face was gray. "Corvette," he said. "Wickham, I ran her pumps in the tank." He laughed and it came out wrong. "Nell, I ran her pumps in the tank when I was 19. I was hungover. I complained about it for a week **. Toma. They knew **, he said. "They knew the whole time. They knew when I was 19 and hungover and complaining about the pumps that one day I would." He stopped. He pressed the back of his wrist against his eyes. Nell put her hand on his shoulder. "Then you know where the pumps are," she said. Toma laughed again, wetly, and this time it came out right. Waking a cold row is one of the ugliest, most beautiful things a human being can watch, and almost no human being ever has. It begins with the wrap. Every mothballed hull is sheathed in a white ablative cocoon, sealed 60 years ago or 6 years ago, and the wrap does not come off. It burns off. The tender comes alongside and paints the hull with a plasma wash, and the cocoon goes up in a slow, silent bloom of white fire that peels back from bow to stern like a flower opening in reverse, and underneath is the ship, bare and gray and absolutely new, because it has never been anywhere. Then the umbilicals go in, and the reactor is spun up over 9 hours by a crew of 4 in a control shack. And there is a moment, Nell would remember this moment when she was old, when the ship's running lights come on for the very first time since it was built, and the great dead thing hanging in the dark quietly opens its eyes. She watched row 12 wake from the observation blister of a yard tender, with her kit in her lap and her helmet on her knees. They came up in ranks. Not all at once, one at a time along the rank, tick, 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 a bead of light running away from her into the black faster than her eye could follow. And then the next rank, and the next, and the next, and the light went out and out and out until the individual ships were no longer individual, and it was just an asterisk line of light, a horizon where there was no horizon. And then the line bent because the row was longer than her eye could hold flat, and it curved away into the dark like a coastline seen from orbit. Somebody beside her was crying. Nell realized after a while that it was the tender pilot, a woman of about 50, who had one hand over her mouth and was flying with the other, and had not made a sound. 61 years, the pilot said when she could. My mother wrapped some of these, she used to say. She stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her glove. She used to say she was gift-wrapping presents for people who weren't born yet, the pilot said, and that we'd never get to see anybody open them. Nell looked out at the light. She was wrong, she said. Hull 41,208 was 311 meters of Tarpon-class frigate, laid down 39 years ago, wrapped 38 years ago, and never once in all that time moved. She had never had a name. Nobody named a cold row hull. There were too many, and it was bad luck, and the Provisions Naming Office was famously 3 decades behind. She had a number and a manifest, and she had 419 seams with *** and KDE** stamped beside them. Nell came aboard through the forward lock with 61 other people, most of whom she had never met, all of whom had spent years of their lives on this specific ship without ever having set foot on it. The captain was a woman named Ivo Petrakis, who was 34 and who, in civilian life, ran a freight scheduling office on Vesta. She had commanded 41,208 in simulation, in 60-day increments, for 11 years. Frame officer, Petrakis said when Nell reported. She looked Nell up and down. How old are you? 22, ma'am. How many of her seams? 419, ma'am. Petrakis nodded slowly. Something in her face eased. Then you know her better than I do, she said. Go walk her, bow to stern, every deck, every trench. If anything is wrong, I want to hear it from you before we're underway, and I will believe you over the diagnostic. Ma'am. Nell walked her ship. It took 9 hours. She went bow to stern, deck by deck, down through the crawl spaces and the keel trenches and the long cold ribs, and her helmet lamp swept across the bare metal, and there they were, one every 20 meters, waiting for her in the dark. NKDA, 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 DSON, NKDA, TOY, NKDA. 4 years of her life, every single hour of it, right here, holding the ship together. She stopped in the aft keel trench, at seam 301, which she remembered laying because she had been 20 and furious, and had spent the whole shift composing a resignation speech in her head, and she put her glove flat against the plate beside her own name. Hello, she said. The ship did not answer. Ships never do. But somewhere above her, through 3 decks of steel, the reactor came up to full and the deck plates began, very faintly, to hum, for the first time in 38 years, for the first time ever. And Nell Cade felt it come up through her boots and into her bones like something enormous drawing its first breath. Line Marshal Ascendant Empire crossed into the human home system 9 days later with 6,040 warships, which was 53% of the grand fleet of the Ascendant Empire, and which was the largest single concentration of force the Empire had assembled in 800 years. And second Auditor Rhess Vaunhal stood on the observation deck of the flagship with his ledger slates in his 4 hands, and watched the yellow star grow, and counted, and prayed to be wrong. The human home system was, at first, exactly what the Bureau had promised. 6,040 Imperial warships came in past the ice line in a wide crescent, and there was nothing there. No pickets, no mines, no fortress moons. The outer dark was empty for 11 hours in every direction, and the flagship's sensor officers reported clean sweep after clean sweep. And on the flag bridge the mood began, very slowly, to lift. Line Marshal Ascendant Empire did not let it lift far. "Traffic," he said. "Heavy marshal, civilian, bulk freighters, tugs, ore carriers, passenger liners, nothing armed." The sensor officer hesitated. "It's a great deal of traffic, Marshal." "Show me." The plot bloomed, and the flag bridge went quiet because the inner system was crawling. 10,000 transponders, 20. The tally kept climbing as the resolution improved. Freighters running between the moons of the gas giants, ferries between the belt habitats, ore boats, tenders, tankers, a species going about its business in a swarm so dense that the plot looked less like a star system and more like a nest. "That is a civilian economy," said Cale's chief of staff, with relief. "That is what a species looks like when it has spent 60 years getting rich instead of arming." "Yes," Cale said, "thank you, that is exactly what it looks like." He did not sound relieved. He walked to the rail and stood looking at the plot, and he thought about the frigate at Sable Verge whose bow had been sheared away, and whose crew had gone out into vacuum to weld it shut. And after a while he said, without turning, "Auditor." Vaunhal came forward. Every officer on the flag bridge watched him come, and their contempt was a physical pressure in the room, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not care. "Where are they?" Cale said. "Marshal, I don't." "You are the only creature in this fleet who believes they have a fleet." Cale's voice was perfectly level. "So, where would you put it?" Vaunhal looked at the plot. He looked at the thick, warm, crawling inner system, and then he looked out, past it, at the great cold nothing where the sensors said there was nothing at all, and he felt the answer arrive in him with the sick certainty of a sum that finally balances. "Marshal," he said, "we have been sweeping for warships." "Yes." "Warships are hot. Reactors, drives, weapons cores, they are hot. And so we look for heat, and we have found no heat, and so we have concluded there are no warships." Vaunhal set down his slates because his hands had begun to shake again, and he did not want them to see it. "Marshal, a ship with its reactor cold is not a warship. Thermally, it is a rock." "Silence." "There are," Vaunhal said, "a great many rocks in this system." Cale looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to his sensor officer and said, in a voice like a door closing, "Sweep the Kuiper belt for geometry not heat. I want straight lines. I want anything out there that is arranged in a straight line." It took the flagship sensor section 40 minutes. Vaunhal watched them work. He watched the officers' postures change, first bored, then puzzled, then very still. He watched one of them run the same processing pass 3 times, and then call a colleague over, and then call a third, and then stand up from her station without permission and stare at her own screen with her hands hanging at her sides. "Report," Cale said. The sensor officer did not turn around. "Marshal," she said, "I have straight lines." "How many?" She made a small sound. It was not a word. "How many, Lieutenant?" "Marshal, they don't resolve as objects. They resolve as asterisk structures asterisk there." She turned around and her face had gone the color of ash. "Marshal, I have straight lines 40,000 kilometers long. I have them in ranks. I have ranks in rows. I have, Marshal, the Kuiper plane out there is ruled asterisk. It's ruled like a page. There are lines out there running past my sensor horizon and I cannot see the ends of them." Nobody spoke. And into that silence, quietly, from 3 light towers out in the cold and the dark, the lines began to come on. Nell Cade felt her ship shudder as the mooring clamps blew, and hull 41,208 slid out of berth 14 into open space for the first and only time in her existence. And Nell, strapped into the frame officer's crash station on the keel deck, 3 decks down, no windows, 1 small repeater screen, saw the whole thing on a monitor the size of her 2 hands. She saw the row light, rank by rank. The frigates first, because frigates woke fastest, 3,000 of them, and each one a needle of light coming on in the dark, and the needles ran away from her down the row until they merged. She saw yard 18 light, 4 million kilometers spinward. She saw yard 20 light. She saw the belt light in a great slow band, 41 yards, one after another, taking 11 minutes to run around the sun. She saw Jupiter's rows come on all at once, because Jupiter had drilled it that way for 30 years, and the gas giant went from a dark disk to a disk wearing a ring of white sparks. And then the repeater's scale changed, automatically, because the plot could no longer fit, and it changed again, and it changed a 3rd time, and what Nell Cade was finally looking at was the entire solar system rendered as a single image, and it was full asterisk. Not full like a battle, full like a page of writing. She had spent 4 years being told she was building a warehouse. She sat there in the dark of the keel deck with her own name stamped 419 times in the steel around her, and she looked at what 61 years of bored, resentful, mocked, underpaid, unglamorous, absolutely relentless human labor had actually built, and she said out loud to nobody, "Oh my God." On the deck above, someone laughed, a high, cracked, delighted, horrified laugh, and then somebody else did, and then the whole ship was making a sound that was not quite cheering and not quite weeping. 62 human beings who had spent their whole adult lives doing something pointless, all discovering at once in the same instant that it had not been pointless. Captain Ivo Petrakis' voice came over the channel, and it was steady and very dry. "Settle," she said. "Nobody has done anything yet. All we have done is switch on the lights." The Imperial flag bridge had gone completely silent. The plot was updating. It kept updating. Every 4 seconds a new tranche of contacts resolved, and each tranche was larger than the last, and the tally in the corner of the plot, the simple, honest, unemotional running count that the flagship's tactical system had been printing there for 800 years, climbed. 11,000. 19,000. 31,000. 44,000. 52,000. It stopped briefly at 58,400, and everyone on the bridge breathed, and then it started again as the trans-Neptunian rows came up, and it went to 61,209, and there it stayed, and it flickered once, and a small note appeared beneath it in the system's flat machine language. Count incomplete, sensor horizon limited, additional contacts probable beyond range. Line Marshal Ossian Kale read that line 3 times. He was 41 years old. He had never lost. He had brought 53% of the Grand Fleet of the Ascendant Empire, 6,040 hulls, the largest concentration of force in 800 years, enough to end 900 species, to a system that had just switched on 61,000 warships and was apologizing for not being able to show him all of them. He put his hands on the rail. he found that he could not immediately let go of it. "The garrison at Sableverge," he said. His voice came out wrong. He tried again. "The garrison at Sableverge, 214 ships. It cost me 91 hulls in 19 days. "Yes, Marshal," said his chief of staff from very far away. 214. Cale turned around. His crest was flat against his skull, which in an HFY is the posture of a creature that has seen a predator. That was only a fraction of their army. Nobody answered him. Because it was worse than that, and the only person on the bridge who understood how much worse was standing quietly by the plot with 4 hands full of legislates. And after a moment's second, Auditor Rhess Vaunhal cleared his throat. "Marshal," he said, "it was not a fraction of their army." Cale stared at him. "It was a fraction of their reserve asterisk," Vaunhal said. He walked to the plot. Nobody stopped him. It occurred to him, distantly, that he was about to speak more words in a row than he had spoken in his entire career, and that they were probably the last words that would ever matter. "Task Group 4, he said. 9th Reserve Flotilla. We read their own designation off their own transmissions, and we assumed it was ceremonial because in our Navy, reserve is a courtesy title we give to the retired." He touched the plot. It rippled. "It is not ceremonial, it is an inventory category." Sableverge was garrisoned by the *9th Reserve Flotilla's *4th Task Group, which means, at minimum, that there are 9 reserve flotillas, and that a flotilla contains at least 4 task groups, and that the task group we fought was drawn from stored hulls, crewed by part-time personnel. "Part-time," Cale repeated. "Marshal, their service is a civic obligation, 60 days a year. Every adult." Vaunhal's voice was very calm now. It was the calm of a man reading out a sum he has checked 4 times. "The ships that cost you 91 hulls in 19 days were crewed by freight schedulers and welders and teachers who trained 2 months a year, flying hulls that had been in storage since before they were born." "That is not possible." "It is extremely possible. It is only slow asterisk." Vaunhal turned to face the bridge. "Marshal, they have been doing this for 61 years. 600 hulls a year. That is nothing. That is a rounding error in an economy that size. It is less than we spend on statuary. We looked for the heat of a war economy and found none, and concluded there was no fleet. And the entire time the fleet was being built in front of us, slowly enough that it never once looked like anything at all." He gestured at the plot, at the ruled and glowing page of it. "They did not build a weapon," he said. "They did not hide a secret. There is no genius here and there is no trick. They simply decided, 61 years ago, to do a small, boring, thankless thing every single day. And then they did it every single day for 61 years, without ever getting bored enough to stop." He looked at the line marshal, and he found that he was not afraid anymore, which surprised him. "We are not outnumbered by their army, Marshal," he said. "We are outnumbered by their patience. The humans did not open fire." That was the thing that would be discussed in the Diadem Court for the next 200 years, in the histories and the war colleges, and the long, slow reckoning that followed. That was the thing nobody could ever quite explain to their own satisfaction. 61,000 hulls came in on the Imperial fleet from every quarter of the system at once, from ahead, from behind, from above and below the ecliptic, closing in a sphere with a mathematical inevitability that took 9 hours to complete, and that no fleet in the history of the galaxy could have broken, and they did not fire. They closed, they took station, they matched vector. And when the sphere was complete, and the Imperial fleet hung at its center like a fly in a bead of amber, and every gun in 6,040 Imperial hulls was hot and pointed outward at a wall of ships that went on past the sensor horizon in every direction. A single human signal came through on the open channel, unencrypted in the Imperial trade tongue, spoken by a woman with a tired, flat, unremarkable voice. Imperial Fleet, this is Admiral Seda Kwon, System Defense. Please stand by for a proposal. Kale keyed the channel himself. His officers stared. This is Line Marshal Asian Kale, he said. Say your terms. They're not terms, Marshal, they're an offer. A pause, the sound of somebody incredibly shuffling paper. You are 1,100 light years from your nearest yard. Your fleet has been underway for 9 months. By our estimate, 60% of your hulls are overdue for a drive overhaul, and you are carrying somewhere in the region of 400,000 crew who are going to run out of food in about 7 weeks. Does that sound approximately right? Kale did not answer. It was, in fact, exactly right. We have no intention of firing on you, Admiral Kwon said. If we fire, you will fire, and you will kill a great many of us. You have very good ships, Marshal, and your gunnery at Sable Verge was excellent. And at the end of it, you will still be dead, and 400,000 people will have burned for absolutely no reason, and I would have to write to every one of their families and explain why. Another pause. So here is the offer, she said. Power down your weapons. Not your shields, not your engines, just your weapons. We will come alongside with tenders. We will overhaul your drives because we have a great many spare parts and frankly, we have nothing else to do with them. We will fill your holds with food. And then we will escort you to the jump line, and you will go home, and you will tell them what you saw. And in exchange, Kale said. In exchange, said Admiral Kwon, you tell them what you saw. The channel hissed softly. That's it, she said. That's the whole price. We're not asking for tribute. We're not asking for your worlds. We're not even asking for an apology, though I'd take one. Something in the flat, tired voice shifted very slightly. Marshal, we didn't build all this because we wanted a war. We built it because 90 years ago something came through here that could have killed us all, and it looked at us, and it didn't even slow down. We have spent 3 generations making sure that never happens again. And I would very much like to now spend the next 3 generations doing literally anything else. Kale stood on his flag bridge, at the center of a sphere of 61,000 ships, in front of 400 officers who were watching him with the frozen, empty stillness of people whose entire understanding of the universe has been quietly removed from underneath them. He thought about the frigate at Sable Verge, with its bow gone, welding itself back together in vacuum. He reached out and he powered down his weapons. The Empire's fleet stood down over the course of 11 hours, ship by ship, weapon by weapon, and the great glowing sphere around it did not move and did not fire, and, as far as anyone aboard the Imperial hulls could tell, did not even seem particularly interested. That was the part that got into the crews. Vaunhal watched it happen from the flagship's observation deck and understood exactly what it was doing to them. If the humans had gloated, if they had broadcast demands or flown victory passes, or done any of the 10,000 things a victorious fleet does, the Empire's crews could have hated them, and hate is a structure a mind can stand on. Instead, the humans sent tenders. They came in slow, fat, ugly little ships with cargo booms and floodlights and no guns at all, and they came alongside Imperial cruisers that had been designed to reduce planets, and they asked permission to come aboard. And then human engineers in scuffed orange suits floated into Imperial engine rooms with toolboxes and looked at Imperial drive assemblies with the frank professional pity of tradespeople examining a job somebody else had botched. Your bearing races are shot, a human chief engineer told the flagship's engineering officer through a translator in the manner of a woman delivering bad news about a roof. All of them. When did you last pull these? They are rated for 400 cycles. They're at 610. There has not been an opportunity to. No, I know, she patted the housing. You've been at war. Nobody overhauls at war. That's why you overhaul before the war. She said it without any malice whatsoever, which was infinitely worse than malice. We've got the races. Give us 9 days. You have spare bearing races, the Imperial officer said slowly, for our asterisk drives. No, she said, we've got spare bearing races. Yours are 11 millimeters undersize on the inner, she shrugged. We'll turn some down. And Vaunhal, standing at the back with his slates, wrote in his ledger. They are repairing us out of stock. They have not manufactured anything. They are simply reaching into a shelf that has been sitting there, full, for 60 years. The shooting happened on the 4th day, and it happened because of one man, which is how these things almost always happen. The heavy cruiser Thren As had a captain named Vex Solandry who was 60 years old and who had spent his entire life inside a story about the Ascendant Empire, and who woke up on the 4th day of the stand-down and discovered that he could not live outside of it. He did not consult anyone. He powered up his forward battery in 11 seconds. His crews were superbly drilled, and he put 4 full-strength lances into the nearest human hull, which was a Kestrel-class corvette named Wickham that was, at that moment, in the middle of transferring 9 tons of protein paste into Thren As' own galley. Wickham came apart, not all at once. The lances went through her at an angle and took her spine, and she folded, and her reactor scrammed, and she began to tumble, venting. Nell Cade was in the aft keel trench of hull 41,208 when it happened, running her 3rd full-frame inspection, because she had run out of things to do and could not sleep. She heard the alarm, she heard the plot call it, and she heard the ship's name, and she was moving before she understood why, hauling herself hand over hand up the trench, and the word going around and around in her head was Toma asterisk. Toma ran her pumps asterisk. Toma ran her pumps in the tank when he was 19 and hungover. The general channel opened. Admiral Quan's flat, tired voice, and for the first time it was not flat. All units, hold fire. 61,000 human warships did not fire. Nell would think about that for the rest of her life, that it would have taken one itchy gunnery officer, one single frightened person out of the 4 million human beings crewing that sphere, and the Ascendant Empire would have ceased to exist in about 90 seconds. Not one of them fired. Hold fire, Quan said again. Target is Thren As, 5th Squadron, disable her. Drives and weapons only. I want that hull intact and I want her crew alive asterisk, and if any of you so much as scratches her pressure envelope I will personally put you on latrine duty until the sun burns out. A breath. Rescue units, Wickham is venting. Go get them. Go get them now asterisk. Hull 41,208 was 4,000 kilometers from asterisk Wickham asterisk, which made her the nearest ship with a certified hull-cutting team. Captain Petrakis's voice came down the channel, and it was calm, and it was fast. Frame officer to the boat deck. Cade, take your team, take your torches. We are going to open that wreck like a tin can. Move. Wickham was tumbling on 2 axes when they came alongside, and her forward third was a ruin, and her aft was still pressurized because somebody in there had gotten a bulkhead shut in time. Nell went across on a tether with a cutting torch on her back and 4 people behind her, and she put her boots on the corvette's hull, and she looked at what she was standing on, and she understood the whole of her life in about 1.5 seconds. Because she knew this hull. Not this ship, she had never touched this ship. But she knew the asterisk plate, knew its thickness, knew its grade, knew where the stringers ran beneath it because the stringers ran where they always ran, because the Tarpon and the Kestrel and the Austria and every other hull humanity had laid down in 61 years, used the asterisk same 19 bolts and the same frame geometry and the same seam spacing asterisk, because some anonymous committee 3 generations ago had spent 4 appalling years arguing about standards and had won. She knew exactly where to cut. She knew it without thinking, the way you know the stairs in your own house in the dark. Here, she said, and dropped to one knee, and put the torch against the plate 2 meters aft of a seam she had never laid and could have laid blindfolded, 20 centimeters in from the rib. Go! They cut into Wickham in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. There were 19 people alive in the aft compartment. Toma Oyalaran was one of them. He was concussed, and his arm was broken in 2 places, and when Nell got her helmet lamp on his face, he squinted up at her and said thickly, "The pumps held." "Shut up, Toma." "Nell, the pumps held," he was crying. "I ran them in the tank when I was." "I know," she said. "I know, come on." They pulled 19 people out of Wickham, and Wickham died, and 11 of her crew died with her, and that was the entire human loss of the war for the home system. 11 human beings in a corvette carrying food to the enemy. Thren Asai was disabled in under 2 minutes by a squadron that shot her drives and her turret mounts off with a precision so surgical that Imperial gunnery officers, watching, made small involuntary noises. She did not blow up. Her hull did not breach. She hung there, blind and lame and utterly helpless, with 1,100 Imperial crew aboard her, and her captain locked in his own flag cabin by his own executive officer, who had shot the lockout with a sidearm and was now weeping into the general channel and begging the humans not to kill his people. The humans did not kill his people. What the humans did was send Hull 41,208. Nell heard the order come down and did not at first believe it. "Ma'am," she said, on the bridge channel, still in her suit, still with Wickham S frost on her gloves and 11 dead people 40 minutes behind her. "You want me to patch her?" "Her drive mounts are open to space and her aft compartments are venting," Petraki said. "There are 1,100 people in there, Cade, and they've got about 4 hours of atmosphere in the sealed sections, and the nearest Imperial tender is 9 hours out because we're the ones with all the tenders." A pause. "You're the best frame hand on this ship. You are, as far as I can tell from your file, one of the best frame hands in this system. Get your torch." Nell stood in the boat bay with her helmet in her hands and her jaw locked and her eyes stinging, and she thought about Toma's arm, and about the 11, and about the 11-hour comm lag and the smell of a mess hall and a tray hitting the deck. Then she thought about a very old woman standing on a maintenance stand saying, "You are not going to be heroes. You are going to be ready." She put her helmet on. The Empire sent an observer with the repair party, because Line Marshal Asian Kale, who was not a fool, understood that his people needed to see this, and because there was exactly one officer in his fleet who had earned the right to go. Second Auditor Rhess Vaunhal crossed to the Thren As in a human shuttle, sitting on a human bench, watching human engineers check human equipment out of human crates, and every single crate was stamped with a depot code. RD014, RD089, RD201. He wrote them down. He could not stop himself. He was going to be writing numbers down until the day he died. They went out onto the Thren As S ruined flank in the dark, 12 humans and 1 HFY, and the great wound in her side breathed out silver crystals of frozen air into the black, and the humans went to work. They did not hesitate. That was what Vaunhal wrote about later in the report that ended the Ascendant Empire's 4,000 years of certainty and began whatever came after. Not the ships, not the sphere, not the number. They did not hesitate. They had never seen an Imperial hull in their lives. They had no schematics. They had no training in HFY construction. And they went at that wound like people who had been repairing hulls, in the cold, in the dark, at 4 in the morning, for their entire lives, because they had, and they cut, and they braced, and they hauled up human plate that had been sitting in a depot for 30 years and bent it to fit asterisk, and they laid down bead after bead after bead of molten alloy across a species boundary that had not existed 6 months ago, and the wound closed. The young one led them. Vaunhal noticed her immediately, because she was the one everyone else looked at before they moved, and because she was so obviously, painfully young, a female, barely into adulthood by his reading of the species, with a face that had not slept and would not sleep. She worked for 6 hours without stopping. At the end of it, when the last plate was welded and the atmosphere gauges on 1,100 Imperial crew began, very slowly, to climb, she ran a hand scanner along the final seam, and the scanner made a small flat sound, and she took a tool from her belt. Vaunhal watched her set it against the Imperial hull. Chunk. He came closer, he had to. She saw him coming and did not stop him, and the two of them floated there together, in the shadow of a crippled Imperial heavy cruiser, and Vaunhal put his light on the mark she had left in his Empire steel. 4 characters. NKD asterisk. He knew that mark. He had knelt on the floor of an empty training hall at the 4th hour of the morning 11 weeks ago, and photographed one exactly like it off a piece of dead keel from Sable Verge, and run it against a linguistic index that had told him it was probably a name. You, he said through the translator on his chest. His voice came out strange. This is you. The girl looked at him through her visor. She was, he realized, about 22, and she was shaking with exhaustion, and there was a smear of somebody's blood dried on the wrist of her suit. Yeah, she said. Why? So you know who did it. She flexed her hands slowly, one at a time, the way people do when they have been holding a torch for 6 hours. If it fails, you'll know who to blame. It will not fail. She looked at the seam. Something moved in her face. No, she said, it won't. Vaunhal looked at the mark, and at her, and out past her shoulder at the lights. 61,000 of them, ranked and ruled and utterly silent, going out and out past the sensor horizon into a dark that even now he could not see the end of. How many are there, he said, truly, not the ones I can see. All of them. And Nell Cade thought about a 93-year-old woman putting down a slate and saying asterisk don't count. It's not a number that helps you. I don't know, she said honestly. Nobody does exactly. Nobody ever added it up because nobody ever thought it mattered. She turned to look at the light with him. We just went to work every day for 61 years. My grandmother went to work. Her mother went to work. A tired, crooked shrug. That's all it is. That's the whole secret. There's no secret. Vaunhal was quiet for a long moment. That is the most frightening thing anyone has ever said to me, he said. Nell laughed, a short, cracked, exhausted human sound, and then she unclipped her tether and went home to sleep. The Ascendant Empire's fleet departed the human home system 22 days later, 6,039 hulls, every drive overhauled, every hold full, escorted to the jump line by a human squadron that peeled away at the boundary with a signal that read, in its entirety, safe transit. Thren Ase went with them, patched under tow, her 1,100 alive. And second Auditor Rhess Vaunhal went home and stood before the diadem court, in the great hall under the crown that had hung above the homeworld for 4,000 years, and delivered his audit. He did not editorialize, he was an auditor. He read out the fastener count, and the depot codes, and the ration expiry dates, and the hull serials, and the interchangeable coupling from a corvette that fitted a cruiser laid down 31 years earlier, and the 61,209 contacts with the machine's flat note beneath. Count incomplete. He read the sentence asterisk, the force engaged at Sable Verge was 214 ships asterisk, and he let it sit there. And then he said the only thing he ever said in that hall, that was not a number. They were not hiding it, he said. That is what the court must understand. It was never hidden. There was no deception. For 61 years they built 600 ships a year in plain view, and paid for it out of a budget line their own people mocked, and stamped the names of welders on the inside of hulls nobody would ever see, and drilled their farmers and their clerks 2 months a year in ships they never expected to fly. He looked up at the crown. We had 4,000 years and 11,000 hulls and 900 subject species, Second Auditor Rhess Vaunhal said, and we lost to a filing system. The court did not answer him. There was, in the end, nothing to say. The Ascendant Empire had spent 4 millennia being the largest thing in every room it entered, and it had walked into a room where a species of accountants and welders had been quietly, boringly, unglamorously stacking crates for 3 generations, and there was no strategy for that, and no counter, and no hope. The Empire made peace. It was the first treaty in its history that it did not dictate, and the humans, to the court's baffled fury, asked for almost nothing. An exchange of embassies, a survey of the sable-verged dead, and a single clause, inserted at human insistence, guaranteeing standardized emergency couplings on all vessels of both powers, so that either fleet could rescue the other. The court signed it. The court did not understand it. The court would spend the next 200 years slowly, painfully, learning to. Nell Cade went back to Yard 19. Hull 41,208 was returned to the Rose, not wrapped, not mothballed, but kept warm now, on 90-day readiness, with a crew that trained 60 days a year and a name at last. She was called Wickham after a corvette that had died carrying food to the people trying to kill her. Nell was offered a commission. She turned it down. She was 23 years old by then, and she went back out into the trench on 3rd shift, in the cold and the dark, with her mask down and her tether clipped to a ring, 400 meters down the keel of a hull that had not been laid down when the war began. Foreman Adie's son, 94 now, still refusing to retire, watched her go with an expression that was very close to peace. Down in the trench, Nell laid her bead. She watched it cool. She ran the scanner, and the scanner said pass. And she took the little pneumatic punch from her belt and set it against the plate and squeezed. Chunk. 4 characters, pressed a ½ millimeter into steel that had never seen a sun, on the inside of a ship that would probably never fly, in a row that ran out past the edge of sight, in a dark that nobody would ever look at. NKDA. Then she moved 20 meters down the trench and started the next one.